How's it going, Frosty friends? Today I'll be sharing some of the techniques I like to use when performing analysis in Apex Legends. This isn't the only way to perform analysis in Apex Legends, but it can be a useful starting point for those of you that are looking to try something new. What's important to realize here is that every single player has their own unique process. Some people are only going to take 5 minutes, some players will take an hour to review a single piece of footage. Just keep in mind that you can start slow and build your own process over time. The goal, in my opinion, from analysis is to build a stronger self-understanding of who you are as a player, where you're strong and where you're weak, and hopefully get some individual granular action items that you can try in-game and test to see if they work or not. That should be pretty much all of the boilerplate stuff you need to get started with analysis, so let's go ahead and start walking through some examples. Let's take a moment to talk about the kinds of footage you want to review. I really think that you should be focusing on individual fights over an entire game. The reason why is because there's a whole lot going on in a single game of Apex Legends, and I really think for the sake of analysis, it's best to keep it short and simple. Since we're going to be looking at fights, let's go ahead and look at our examples to see what kinds of fights we're going to want to look at first. The best fights to look at are going to be fights like this one, where you are originally winning the fight and then you wind up losing or get knocked. When things are going well, it implies that you have a handle on things, and once they start to go poorly, it usually indicates that this is the end of your comfort zone. The benefit of looking at videos like these is that it's going to help you increase the strength of your comfort zone. This helps you guide the game to similar situations where you're more likely to use what you've learned already instead of having lots of random little things that you won't use every single game. The next type of fights you should look at are ones like this one, where your team stomps the enemy team. A lot of people say that you learn best from failure, and I'll explain why I tend to disagree. Usually a stomp happens for one of two reasons. The first is that you just played into a strong point within your game, and the other is because the enemy made a really big and obvious error. The whole point of looking at footage like this is to completely master situations and skills that lie within your comfort zone. It's not good enough to say that I win these situations some of the time or even most of the time. You need to be getting these skills to the point where you can say, I win these situations all the time, or at least as close as is humanly possible. On the other side of the coin, when the enemy makes an error, it gives you a chance to observe what a really obvious error looks like from a third-person perspective, and also how these errors tend to get punished. In reality, you can only get W key pushed by a stimmed up Octane when you're sitting behind a piece of cover so many times before you start to think, maybe this isn't the best idea. So the last kinds of fights that you'll want to look at are the fights where your team is the one that gets rolled. Generally, in these situations, it's either very obvious what you did wrong, in which case analysis probably isn't necessary, or you're misunderstanding something very important about that fight. It doesn't make sense in this case to focus on things you're probably going to struggle to understand and execute when you've already got these almost winnable fights, like in the first example, where you're more likely to turn a loss into a win. The other reason I don't like to look at this kind of footage is because it potentially leads to a negative mentality and can hurt your confidence. Analysis shouldn't lead you to think things like I suck or I always get this wrong. It should lead you to these are the things that I know I am good at and I can try this thing next time. So now that we're looking at the right footage, let's talk about some of the techniques that I like to use for gathering information from this footage. I personally play and pause the video at key moments, but some people like to do it in slow motion or even full motion, so really it's whatever works best for you. I'll go ahead and show you my play pause method with our first example of a winning fight that got turned into a losing one. So once I've paused the video, I make a point to list the facts that I know right then. Sometimes I'll write it down, sometimes I'll just say it in my head, sometimes I'll actually even say it verbally. It really just depends on the day. Let's go ahead and get started with what we know about what's going on with the enemies. The enemy Revenant just got their purple armor cracked and they're hiding behind this rock in front of us. There's an additional enemy that is shooting Peyruis from behind that rock. Our teammate has recently made a call out. Octane has 80 shields remaining, but we have no visual on the Octane, and our teammate just gave us an enemy ping on the rock. Finally, there's a third enemy whose identity and location is completely unknown. Let's take a moment to take stock of what's going on with our teammates. Wraith is behind me and to the right, and they've got a good angle on enemies that I just cracked, and they've also got full shields. Peyruis, on the other hand, is further down the tunnel to the left, and they're missing 75 of their shields. In terms of the position, I've got very little cover to work with, and in terms of actual distances from the enemy position, I have to go now if I want to push the enemy and punish the enemy Revenant for trying to do a battery. The next thing I'll do is I'll try to identify what the enemy and my teammates are trying to accomplish in this situation. I alluded to it before, but the enemy Revenant probably wants to heal with a battery since I just broke all of their shields. Or he may attempt to run, but the angles really don't work out for him, so it's hard for him to do that. The enemy behind the rock is going to want to maintain covering fire to ensure that their teammate Revenant can get the battery off and so that Peyruis doesn't wind up pushing into them. Since we don't have any information on the last enemy, it's pretty hard to tell what they're going to do next. In terms of our teammates, Peyruis is probably willing to continue trading at a distance, but it's unlikely that he's going to push before doing a battery. If the Wraith has a good angle on these enemies behind the rock and they have a line of sight, then they're probably going to want to hold the angle to cover my push and continue putting damage into the enemies. Otherwise, they may opt to go hip to hip with me as I push this cover. Now that we've sort of taken stock of the situation and what our teammates and enemies are trying to do, this is where we start to look for errors in our judgment or any assumptions we made. So the error in this situation is that I made a decision based on the assumption that the enemy Octane was the other enemy that was behind that rock. If that were the case, I'd be pushing one enemy that's only got 20 shields remaining and another enemy that's already taken damage on their HP. In this situation, I'm very confident that I'll be able to find the Revenant and knock in and then trade for significant damage on the Octane if I wind up going down at all. In reality, the other enemy behind the rock is going to be Horizon, and we find out that the Octane actually has a really nasty crossfire angle on me as I push across this open ground. It's pretty clear here that the issue is that I pushed across open ground without complete knowledge of where the enemy team was. The surprise of finding an enemy that's prepared to fight back as I round this corner leads me to be extremely inefficient with my life in spite of the fact that we had such a strong start to this fight. We're not going to review all the other examples with this level of detail, but just quickly, the fight where we stopped the enemy, some important piece of information I saw there were that the enemy Caustic never threw a barrel, and that the Bloodhound didn't turn to help their teammate, instead tunnel visioning on their shots on my teammates. Finally, I made the observation that this is a way I commonly tend to use the Mastiff successfully, which is to push weakened enemies looking for a quick one pump to finish them off and open up the situation. So important information that I saw in our last example is that when the enemy Gibraltar double door kicked me, I didn't knock him. I was slow to react to his strafe and I overcompensated when I finally did react, causing me to hit way less shots. I also noticed that my cover use against the enemies when they entered hip to hip through the door still allowed all three of them to keep a line of sight on me. So now that we have all of this information that we observed from our analysis, we have to turn them into actual changes that we make within our game. Some of the things that I like to do is I like to identify alternative courses of action that I or the enemy could have taken and then actually lay our counterplay on top of that. And so if we think back to the second example, the Bloodhound definitely should have turned to help their teammate as I pushed them, and the Caustic should have thrown a barrel to protect himself. The counterplay that I could have made to actually beat this is to probably just throw a grenade before even pushing the cover so that I wouldn't have to deal with the situation at all. The other thing that I like to do is try to think about the shared concepts and fundamentals that span across multiple situations. And so if we think back to our first example, one of the fundamentals we could take away is that bad things tend to happen when you push across open ground without knowing where all the enemies are. And so then once you've got all of these ideas, you want to start to turn them into positive action items. These are small, finite little rules or tricks or mental exercises you can do in order to just sort of change up the way that you play and think about the game. So maybe some of the action items that you could implement based on these examples are to always be able to count all three enemies before making a push to secure the first knock, and also to always throw a grenade before pushing just to get yourself in the habit of using grenades more effectively. I think it's best when you're working with these positive action items to have one that you work on at a time and then just keep a list in the background. When you're trying something new, I think trying something new once really isn't a good way to tell whether it works or it doesn't. And I would say the minimum is probably 3 to 5 times, but personally I recommend 10 times. If you try something new 10 times in a row and it does not work, then it's very likely that is not the thing that you should be trying to do next. The other thing you may have noticed is that a lot of these rules were pretty rigid. And so throwing a grenade every single time you push someone, that's kind of ridiculous. But when you're trying to introduce a new habit, then sometimes having a really rigid rule like that can help you start to see things from a different perspective. And then you step the rule back, right? And you don't throw a grenade every single time, but you start to identify these are the times when it actually is useful to throw a grenade. Eventually, along the way, you'll run into these things called bad habits that you're trying to change. And people get really frustrated when trying to change bad habits because they try so hard and it just doesn't change. You have a bad habit because at some point in time, it did something for you. And maybe it was true at the time, but it's not true anymore, which is why you're trying to change it. But what's important is that you understand why you're doing the bad habit. You understand what benefit it brought before, and then you start to try and think through what are the benefits that my alternative course of actions also bring and help address the needs that the bad habit did, way back when I was a worse player. So I know that trying to change a bad habit can be really frustrating, but it's a very natural human tendency to form habits. And so I hope some of this like helps you take a more positive mindset when it comes to actually changing these bad habits. That's pretty much it for the techniques I like to use when performing analysis on my own gameplay, but it's not the end all be all of all analysis, and everyone's going to have their own process. I actually think it would be really great if people share their own techniques that they like to use in the comments below. Finally, if you really feel like you would benefit from like an example like based on your own footage, if you message me in Discord, and as long as time permits, then I'm willing to do analyses of your footage on stream. Just message me in Discord. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, stay frosty, my friends. Good luck, have fun, and we'll see you next time.